Imagine stepping out of your front door, not onto a bustling cobblestone street, but into an endless ocean of white ash and still smoking ruins. It is September 1666, and London, the beating heart of an empire, has just been erased. The heavy, suffocating smoke has finally begun to clear on the horizon, revealing a nightmare landscape that stretches as far as the eye can see, bringing an apocalyptic silence to a sprawling metropolis that just days before was a vibrant cacophony of merchants, wooden carts, and thousands of shouting voices. We are looking at the immediate, terrifying aftermath of the Great Fire of London, a catastrophe that has just violently devoured 85% of the medieval capital and left a staggering estimated 100,000 men, women, and children completely destitute, huddled in shivering, traumatized masses on the open fields of Moorfields, Finsbury, and Islington. To understand the sheer, unprecedented scale of this devastation, we have to look back at the deceptively simple spark that ignited this hellscape just days prior in a small, cramped bakery on Pudding Lane. Owned by Thomas Farriner, a carelessly forgotten oven fire was all it took to change history forever. But this was a tiny spark born into a perfect, fatal storm of disaster. London in 1666 was essentially a giant tinderbox, heavily overcrowded, with ancient timber-framed buildings coated in highly flammable pitch, with upper stories jutting out so far they practically touched each other across the narrow, winding alleyways. Furthermore, the city had been baked mercilessly by a relentlessly hot, dry summer. And when the fire broke out, a fierce, driving east wind acted like a colossal bellows, pushing the flames across the city with a terrifying, unstoppable speed that overwhelmed the primitive leather fire buckets and fire hooks used by the desperate citizens. Now, standing in the ashes, after the blaze has finally died down, the physical reality of what has happened is almost too immense for the human mind to comprehend. The intricate, claustrophobic maze of medieval streets is simply gone, wiped from the map entirely. In its place is a smoldering, leveled wasteland where the ground is literally still too intensely hot to walk on. The cobblestones themselves have been shattered and blackened by the furnace-like heat, and rivers of melted lead from the towering roof of the magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral have run down the sloping streets, hardening into bizarre, shiny pools amidst the endless sea of gray soot. For the survivors, the immediate shock is paralyzing. They are standing at the edges of the remaining city walls, staring into a smoking crater that holds the remains of 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, the iconic Guildhall, and the absolute destruction of their entire livelihoods. The streets they walked every single day are unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks and neighborhood boundaries have vanished, making it completely impossible for people to even locate where their own homes used to stand. The heat radiating from the collapsed basements and cellars is so intense that spontaneous fires will continue to violently flare up from the rubble for months to come. As the terrifying adrenaline of the frantic evacuation finally wears off, the true horror of their new reality begins to set in for the massive, weeping crowds camped in the surrounding dirt fields. They are completely exposed to the autumn elements, clutching whatever meager, random possessions they manage to drag away from the advancing flames. A bundle of scorched clothes, a heavy iron cooking pot, perhaps a few saved coins, or a salvaged piece of wooden furniture. Panic begins to ripple through the makeshift refugee camps, fueled not just by the devastating loss of their homes, but by the immediate, terrifying specter of mass starvation. The city's massive storehouses, granaries, bakers, and bustling markets have all been reduced to useless cinder, leaving an agonizing realization that the infrastructure of their entire civilization has evaporated overnight. Before they close the gates, rumors begin to spread like wildfire among the desperate crowds, with terrified whispers claiming that the fire was no accident at all, but a deliberate act of sabotage by foreign enemies, setting the stage for even more chaos. Despite the overwhelming devastation and the creeping, suffocating despair of the squalid refugee camps, the sheer, stubborn resilience of the human spirit began to slowly take root in the blackened, toxic soil of the ruined capital. The physical resurrection of London was an incredibly daunting, almost unimaginably complex task that would ultimately consume and define an entire generation. Before the smoldering ground had even fully cooled, ambitious visionaries and brilliant architects like Christopher Wren and John Evelyn were already hastily sketching magnificent utopian blueprints. They desperately wanted to completely redesign the entire city from scratch. Envisioning wide, sweeping Parisian-style boulevards, perfectly symmetrical piazzas, and grand, orderly waterfronts. However, the chaotic, messy reality of desperate property owners furiously clinging to the exact, invisible boundaries of their old, incinerated plots meant that these grand geometric visions were quickly abandoned in favor of immediate, practical reconstruction. Instead, the old winding medieval street plan was largely retained, but the fundamental structural DNA of the city was radically and permanently altered by the absolute, undeniable necessity of survival. To ensure that such an apocalyptic city-killing catastrophe could absolutely never happen again, Parliament passed the extraordinarily strict Rebuilding of London Act. This crucial, sweeping piece of historical legislation heavily regulated the entire future of the city, strictly mandating that all new houses, without exception, had to be constructed entirely of solid brick or stone. It completely banned the highly flammable timber framing, the thatched roofs, and the dangerously overhanging upper stories that had tragically turned the old city into a fatal tinderbox. Furthermore, the claustrophobic alleys were systematically widened, paved, and properly drained, inadvertently creating a much healthier, surprisingly modern environment that ironically helped to permanently purge the lingering, filthy squalor that had fueled the deadly outbreaks of the bubonic plague. But this colossal historical resurrection was absolutely not a fast, magical transformation. It was a grueling, painfully slow, and economically devastating process that dragged on for agonizing decades. Tens of thousands of the original displaced citizens, having lost everything they owned, simply could not afford to rebuild. They never returned to the historic city center, choosing instead to permanently settle in the sprawling, rapidly growing suburban villages like Clerkenwell, Islington, and Spitalfields that had initially served as their desperately cold refugee camps. This massive forced migration forever expanded the vast, sprawling footprint of Greater London, changing its demographics permanently. For the resilient merchants and families who did return to the ashes, they lived and worked in a perpetual, noisy, and incredibly dusty construction site for the rest of their natural lives. The crowning, glorious jewel of this monumental blood and sweat effort was the slow, magnificent rise of the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Its breathtaking, iconic dome, eventually soaring high above the resurrected brick-built skyline as a profound, defiant symbol of the city's sheer, unbreakable will to survive, to ensure the immense human tragedy and the terrifying lessons of the flames were never forgotten by future generations. A massive, towering Doric column, simply known as the Monument, was erected near the exact ignition point on Pudding Lane, standing as a somber, silent sentinel over the newly widened, bustling streets below. Ultimately, the Great Fire of 1666 did not just brutally destroy an ancient medieval capital. It violently, forcefully demanded the agonizing, fiery birth of a truly modern metropolis. The traumatized, shivering survivors who initially stared into that smoking, apocalyptic crater could never have comprehended that their unimaginable suffering, their profound and heartbreaking loss, and their sheer, back-breaking physical labor would directly lay the indestructible stone foundations for one of the greatest, most enduring cultural and financial empires the modern world has ever seen. The fire mercilessly took absolutely everything from them. But from those terrifying, choking ashes, they stubbornly, defiantly built the future.